Hello, hello. Let me just check that I'm actually okay. Yeah, my mic is working. Okay, welcome to my next update on the One deck. And I basically just wanted to add a bunch of small stuff that I have been thinking about. Nothing really major, but just a lot of small things. And I kind of enjoy making these videos. So, yeah. And first of all, I'm going to talk a bit about some cuts and additions and some new considerations. I have been playtesting a bit more, not as much, but a bit. And I've also been going deep on some Scryfall searches as well. And I have some pretty interesting findings. And then I'm going to talk about something I haven't really touched upon at all, and that is really the other worms that are available. And they, after Wolves by Worm, Impervious Grey Worm, and Gotama, they all kind of drop off, or there's a huge drop off. And the next sort of tier of worms are not really worth playing, but I thought I'd showcase them and talk about them just in case, because we'll probably not get new worms all that often. So it's good to know what we have to work with. And then lastly, I'm just going to talk a bit about how this deck is going to win, the win conditions, because I haven't really been talking a lot about that up until now. And it's definitely the most shaky part of the deck, or so to say, the thing I'm most unsure of. So I thought I'd kind of monologue a bit about it. Maybe I'll say something that brings me further. And I have some nice coffee. Okay, so some cuts. And first off, I just wanted to mention Turntimber Symbiosis straight out, because I thought that, I always knew that you were probably almost never going to cast this card. But I thought, maybe in the Sages there was some like 1% scenarios where you would. And I also kind of thought, which is another point, that I could just throw in all these different utility lands and there'll just always be space enough for them. But it actually turns out that there's not a lot of space at all in the lands. So for utility lands, so like we want all the fetch lands, we want all the most important utility lands, and we want a decent number of basics. And between all that, there's really not a lot of slots left. Definitely not for something like Timber Symbiosis. We need all our utility lands to be extremely relevant in order for them to justify being in the deck. And next up, I just wanted to talk about Cultivate and Kondamas Reach. And I still think that these are good. But I just, doing playtesting, I found that I ran out of basics pretty fast. And there's actually a decent number of basic searches in the deck between, Search for Tomorrow, Rampant Growth, Emergent Sequence. I'm probably missing something, but like there's like a decent number of searchers that search for basics. And I was just doing gold fishing. I was just running out of basics. And so I cut these ones because they do take 2 basics from the deck. And so oftentimes you might have 1 basic left in the deck, but probably not 2. And so, yeah, these ones, I still think they're good, but maybe they'll get back into the deck once I find a way to include more basics. Next up is Overwhelming Stampede. I still think this card is good, but the problem is that compared to other Thramak decks, this isn't really a super go wide deck. Like the only real way of going super wide is with Field of the Dead and a bunch of landfalls, and that can definitely happen, but not that often. And the setup, basically, the scenario where you have a whiteboard, you have some sort of worm that has a lot of power and toughness, or a lot of power to buff the rest of your team. It's not unrealistic, but I just think it's a bit too narrow right now. But maybe it'll get back in. And then doubling season. And after thinking about this card, basically it works great with Field of the Dead. It works great with Wellspine Worm, kinda. So Wellspine Worm's death trigger creates 6 worms instead. And then it works kind of okay with our commander in the sense that it doubles the counters on him, so that beforehand, where we are looking to probably sacrifice to devour 6 on Thermag, to get a power of 36, power toughness on Thermag of 36, where 36 is probably enough to do everything you want to do. Then this card kind of says that since the counters on Thermag is doubled with doubling season, we only really need 4. So with the power 4, he becomes a 16/16, and that is doubled to 32/32, and that is kind of in the same ballpark as 36/36. And the reason this is not super good is that the difference between 4 and 6 creatures is not that large. I mean, it's not like we are like saving a huge amount of creatures or like getting this big shortcut. And then, with the same amount of creatures, and then there's definitely also the case where having too many tokens and devouring for like a bunch is cool and fun because you get this huge Thermag, and with doubling season he gets even bigger, but it's kind of overkill. It's not really necessary. Nobody, unless you're playing against a life deck, nobody is going to have 200 life. And you're not going to have, and if you choose to draw cards of Thermag, you're not even going to have 200 cards in your library. And so if Thermag is too big, it might actually be pretty bad for you because you can now not draw any of your big draw. You cannot really play any of your big draw spells anymore without decking yourself. So I think that the effect of doubling on Field of Dead is nice, and the effect of doubling Wellspine Worm tokens is nice. But if that's the only thing, then 5 mana is kind of a lot. So right now I'm putting this in considering instead of the main deck, because I just think that there's not really enough payoffs to justify this very big 5 mana enchantment. And lastly, Mana Bond. This is like a very interesting card. I've been thinking a lot about this, and basically, what Mana Bond does is that it lets you utilize a very large hand. Maybe you have like 15 to 30 cards in your hand, and it lets you dump all your lands on the field. That could be very powerful with Field of the Dead and with Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle, and also just ramp you like a ton. But the problem is that you discard your hand. And so you need a workaround, and you need some way of getting back into the game after you dump your entire hand with Mana Bond. And right now, I don't see a lot of ways to do that. The only one I really think is viable or semi-viable is Past in Flames, because it has flashback from the grave. But Past in Flame in general is not super nice in this deck, so it's kind of like, oh, you have to play this mediocre card in order to make this other kind of weird card work, and you have to have them both at the same time. And Mana Bond doesn't really do anything. I actually think the best use case of Mana Bond is just playing it turn 1, dumping, like if you have a hand with a lot of lands in, and you just dump it on turn 1, and maybe you have a Mirror's Guile to get back into the game. But yeah, so doing gold fishing, I just really haven't really been able to do something crazy with this card, even though it seems like it should be possible to do something crazy with this card. But I haven't been able to really. The big payoff is having Valakut the Molten Pinnacle and winning with Mana Bond, but you need a lot of lands. Like if you have one Valakut and you and you can kind of assume maybe your opponent is a 30, you need, or around 30, you need like 10, 11 lands in your hand, and with a land percentage of 35, because the dual phase lands don't really count as this, although they don't work with Mana Bond. So 35% lands. So that means you have to draw, in order to get 10 lands in hand, you have to draw a lot. Basically, you have to draw, let's see, I can't really do the math right now, but it's more than it's more than 20, right? And it's probably like 20, or closer to 30 cards for you to have have a decent probability of having at least 10 lands in hand. So, and that's usually not one big draw spell. That's probably two, right? Because one big draw spell most often draws us 15 to 16 cards. And so to get to 30, we need to play two big draw spells. And then even if we have 10 lands in hand, or 10 plus lands in hand, that's only around 30 damage with one Valakut. Now, if we do have a second one or a third one from Thespian Stage or Vesuva, then we can possibly win the game with this. But that's just a large amount of setup, basically. And maybe it is worth it to just have Mana Bond in this one slot. It only takes up one slot, and there is some cases where if we can draw 30 cards, and if we have the Vesuva and the Thespian Stage, we can use it to win the game. But it's pretty dead otherwise. So for now, it's back to considering. Okay, and now for some new additions. And the first one is this new card from the new Commander set, and I don't necessarily think it's very good. It's 7 mana, and each player shuffles all creatures they own into their owner's. Its name is Collision of Realm. It's a sorcery, and each player shuffles all creatures they own into their library. Each player who shuffles a non-token creature, this is pretty important, into their library, this way reveals card from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card, then put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of the library in a random order. So to polymorph with this, we need a non-token, and that's pretty much only one of our worms, of course, but otherwise it's only Dried Arbor. Now, on the plus side, it's not that difficult to get Dried Arbor, especially by turn 7. We would probably have drawn away to get Dried Arbor. Like, there's like 20 different cards that fetch Dried Arbor. And in that case, it's pretty nice because it's a board wipe and a polymorph spell, and those usually we tend to see that a board wipe for 4 mana is worth it, and a polymorph spell is usually 4 mana. So that's combined, it's 8 mana, and then this is 7 mana, so it's essentially a good deal, but it is 7 mana, and that's hard to look away from. But I mean, it is also a board wipe that leaves us with a worm on the field, and that's powerful. I mean, that's a powerful card. So right now I'm just trying it out, and this one is hard to test with in gold fishing, so I'll have to wait to get it in real life. But I mean, it's also pretty fun. So I think it's decent and it fits the theme. And that's the most important thing. This is a polymorph worm deck, and this is a polymorph spell. And I'm pretty much playing every polymorph spell I can get my hands on. So not everything is about power. But next up is Mass Hysteria, and I was in the previous videos I have been talking about Concordant Crossroads a lot and how that I can't afford Concordant Crossroads, and it made me think that there's probably a similar effect in red, right? Since haste is kind of the red thing. And lo and behold, there's of course a completely functional, identical enchantment to Concordant Crossroad, but in red, and it's called Mass Hysteria. And yeah, basically, I think that this kind of effect is good in this deck for some different reasons. First of all, it's pretty powerful to get the worm you polymorph into going immediately. So you get a 15/15 Willspine Worm, and you can immediately crash into one of your opponents. And 15 damage is a lot, especially if you get it out by turn 3 or turn 4. And then in the same way with our commander. Now, our commander and also the Imperious Great Worm don't have trample, so just giving them haste is not necessarily enough, but it is half of the equation. We ideally want them to get trample and haste, especially our commander. But giving them haste is still powerful. It still allows us to do a surprise attack. And especially for our commander, I mean, playing a vanilla 36/36 onto the board and hoping to wait an entire turn to get to attack with it, even if it has trample, is just very unrealistic. But having it with haste is like so important because we can wait. Like doing gold fishing, we don't experience many times. We don't actually need to force our commander out very often at all. We have plenty of other things to do in the deck, and so we can kind of leave our commander in the command zone and play him at the right moment when the enemy's shield are down. And in that case, it's very beneficial that he has haste. And kind of another reason that I think is good is because it really enables Cryptolith Rite. And so Cryptolith Rite is this enchantment that says creatures you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool and cost 2. And so if our creatures have haste or tokens we make have haste, we get this mana immediately as we create the tokens. Now, Cryptolith Rite is kind of a card I've been discussing in previous videos, and I've been kind of on the fence about it, and I still am. But I think Mass Hysteria synergizes really nicely with it, in the sense that, especially with Field of the Dead in the late game, where we can probably create a bunch of zombie tokens, and if they all have haste, then Cryptolith Rite essentially says, every land drop we make will create 1 or more zombie tokens, depending on how many copies of Field of the Dead we have on the board. And that will then generate that much mana. So it essentially accelerates us immediately. Instead of having to wait for the tokens to lose Summoning Sickness, we can, with Mass Hysteria and Cryptolith Rite on the board, play a lot of lands and have that be mana generation. And I think this deck can struggle with generating mana at the turn where it goes where it really tries to go off, because there's not a lot of instantaneous mana. There's not a lot of rituals and stuff like that. But these two cards together act like, essentially make all of your creatures into these kind of rituals. So I think that there is something here. And then lastly, Fruit of the First Tree is cards that I found pretty deep in a Scribeball search. And I have never seen this card before or even heard it mentioned. But it's a 4 mana aura, and when enchanted creature dies, You gain X life and draw X card, where X is its toughness. Now, our worms have as much toughness as power, so there's no real a deficit to this card working off toughness instead of power. And it essentially does what the rest of our big draw spells do, in that it draws us X cards, where X is 15 to 16. And the slight hoop is that we have to find some way for the creature to die. And that can be an issue. In worst case, our commander can do this. But that's obviously not the best way of doing it. But still, like, we are already playing cards like Pattern of Rebirth that also has this, is an aura which enchants a creature, and we have to find some way of having that creature die. And this is the same thing, but it's on the opposite side of the spectrum. Instead of being a polymorph spell, it's a pair of spell. I think it's really good, and I think that we want to play as many of these big draw spells as we can get, and this is not, this is not more expensive than the rest of our spells. Like 4 mana is definitely what we expect, and it draws us as many cards as all the other big draw spells. It just has this slight hoop. And of course, it's an aura, so it can be interacted with a bit more easily by our opponents, but there's plenty of ways our opponents can interact with all our other card draw spells. Yeah. And then I just wanted to return to these cards. I think I've shown them in previous videos on Metamorphosis. I kind of dismissed in the previous video, I think, saying that it was too niche. And this was mainly due to a comment I got on Reddit where somebody said that, Metamorphosis only works with Willspine worms, really. At that time, I didn't have Impervious Great Worm in the deck. It does work pretty well with that card as well, but basically that it's pretty dead unless you have Willspine Worm or Impervious Great Worm on the field. And that's because it says sacrifice a creature to add an amount of mana equal to its casting cost +1 to a mana pool. This mana can be any one color. Oh, I'm just reading now that it can only be used to cast summon spells. Okay, so this definitely makes the card completely unplayable. Okay, I just didn't see that before. I thought the mana could be used for anything, but it can only be used to cast summon spells or creature spells. That makes the card completely unplayable. Okay, I'll have to double check that on the Oracle. In fact, let me do that right now. Let me just check on Spyfall. Spend this mana only to cast creature spells. Okay, well, this card is completely unplayable in the deck, I guess. Okay, moving on. Another case of me not reading a card properly. Moving on to Rupture, which I think I'm reading properly. And this card is a 3-mana sorcery. And it says sacrifice a creature, Rupture deals damage equal to that creature's power to each creature without flying and each player. And so this is kind of a Chandra's Ignition, except it doesn't hit creatures with flying, and you have to sacrifice the creature. But it's 2 mana less. Like Chandra's Ignition is 5 mana, and this card is 3 mana. And I'm just gonna double check this, but as you can see, this sacrifice a creature part is not an additional cost to cast a spell. So this can be helpful and not helpful, I guess, because the thing is that if we sacrifice, let me just get back to this one. If it was sacrifice a creature as an additional cost, we could sort of get around instant speed removal, but we would be host quite a bit with counterspells. And this card gets around that in the way that even if they counter this card, we don't have to sacrifice our creatures, since we wait with sacrificing until the spell is resolved. So yeah, and I basically think that this card is pretty good because Chandra's Ignition is pretty good. Or Chandra's Ignition is amazing. It's one of our win conditions, and this card is essentially the same but cheaper. So, and if we, for example, with our commander, use Chandra's Ignition to win the game, deal 36 to everyone, then we don't really care that, or say we wouldn't mind sacrificing our commander because the game is going to end anyway. So then at that point, if we were to play Chandra's Ignition to win the game, then we would actually like a Rupture better. And then in the other case where we play it on a worm, then we don't really mind sacrificing the worm anyway, and especially sacrificing the Wellspine Worm, because since the sacrificing a creature is part of this spell's resolve effect when it resolves, the tokens from the Wellspine Worm will go on the stack and kind of survive, in the sense that the Wellspine Worm will die as this card resolves. So the tokens won't get hit by this. Now, if it were the other way around, where we had to sacrifice this as an additional cost, then the trigger, the Wellspine Worm's death trigger, would go on the stack and resolve before Rupture would resolve. And so the tokens would die. And so this is kind of a nice interaction, particularly with Wellspine Worm. And then I have some new cards I'm considering. I'm just going to go through these quickly. First of all, I guess the Great Aurora. Each player shuffles all cards from his or her hand and all permanents he or she owns into his library, then draws that many cards. Each player may put any number of land cards from his or her hand onto the battlefield. So basically, this card is pretty nice if we have like an extremely large hand size. We can kind of just board wipe everyone else. And then we can probably play because if we have 30 cards in hand and we play this card, we can probably play around 10 lands or maybe more. So we board wipe the entire field and we start the game with 10 lands and a nice full grip of cards that we can play immediately, because our lands don't enter tapped. So this is a pretty powerful effect in theory, right? We basically we ramp probably and board wipe everyone else and reset our turn. So I think this card could be pretty good, but of course it's 9 mana, so yeah, and it's kind of like it only really works if you have a lot of cards in hand, and it only really board wipes our opponents if they don't have a lot of cards in hand. So yeah, and then there's Cream of the Crop. Whenever a creature comes into play under your control, you may look at the top X card of your library, where X is that creature's power. If you do, put one of those cards on top of your library and the rest at the bottom of any order. So this is pretty nice with polymorphing, because when you polymorph 15/15 into play with Cream of the Crop on the table, you get to look at top 15 and put one on the top. So this is pretty nice if you're looking for that big draw spells to play next turn, but you don't have it in hand, and you can kind of search for it with this card. So that's pretty cool. I don't know actually how good it is. I'll have to try it because it's pretty hard to evaluate. It's kind of a semi-tutor card that triggers when one of your worms enters the battlefield. I mean, with our commander being very huge, we can look through like half of our deck and find Rapture or Chandra's Ignition. That's pretty nice. So I think it might be decent. It's just what cards to take out in place of it, I think. And next is Underworld Breach, and this is kind of I just wanted to put it here because I can't really muster the brain power to evaluate if this card is good in the deck. But there is definitely a lot of cases where you have, I found when gold fishing, it's not uncommon to have a large graveyard. Like that's pretty common because sometimes you play Earth of Druids and you mill a bunch of cards, and sometimes you draw 15 and you have to discard down to 7 because you don't have Reliquary Tower. And the next turn you draw a bunch of cards again and have to discard down again. And so it's not uncommon for this deck's graveyard to be pretty big. And so I would imagine that Underworld Breach is useful. But I don't see it right now. I just wanted to put it here. Then there's Gamble, and Gamble probably is an amazing card in this deck, to be honest, because it's basically a 1-mana tutor, and if you have like 10 or 15 cards in hand, then discarding a card at random is so unlikely to hit the card you tutored for. So it's basically free to a 1-mana demonic tutor in this deck. And it's also great because it can get you, even before you have this large hand size, it could give you a shot of getting a polymorph if you're missing that, or any of the pieces you're missing. So I definitely think this card is just amazing in this deck. Right now I don't have a copy, so yeah. And then Rapture we have already talked about. And then there's Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast. I think these are probably pretty good interaction in this deck because even though I haven't played other than gold fishing with this deck yet, I do foresee that one of the ways that this deck is stopped is through counterspells. Because we are essentially casting a lot of sorceries on our turn, and basically if somebody can stop our sorceries from resolving, we are probably going to lose. And so I think that these protection spells are pretty nice to have because they're very cheap. And so you can probably play this card while also playing the spell, or you probably have mana open to play this card as protection. Yeah. And then there's Past in Flames, and kind of in the same way as Underworld Breach, maybe there is something here that I'm not seeing because the deck does have a large graveyard often, but I'm just not seeing it right now. So these are in considering so that I'm aware of them while playing. And then Veil of Summer is basically just a better version of Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast. It draws cantrips, and our spells can be countered, and our permanents gain hexproof from blue and black. This is definitely the best interactive spell the deck can play, I think. Like, period. There's no better interactive spell for the deck to run. Right now, I'm not really running it because I don't necessarily mind my opponents being able to interact with my game plan. So I guess if I'm getting constantly stopped when I'm trying to combo off, and my worms are constantly getting removed by blue and black spells, and my big draw spells are constantly getting countered, then I guess I'll put one of these in. Next up is an interesting one in Warping Whale. It's a 2-mana instant. And first of all, it's important to point out this card, you must have a colorless land to play this card. And that's actually not that impossible in this deck. We do play a lot of colorless utility lands, so I do think that this card is pretty castable. You exile it. You can choose one exile target creature with power toughness 1 and less, kind of target sorcery spell, or put a +1 a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Sign creature onto the battlefield, and it has sacrificed this creature, add colors to mana pool. And so basically, this is a way of creating a polymorph target. And it's also kind of, which at the polymorph target is kind of a bootleg treasure token as well. So you can use it to like ramp momentarily. And then its 2 other modes are like some very weak interaction that might come up sometimes. But right now, I'm not so high on this card because even though there's a lot of colorless lands in this deck, I do think that if we want to use it as a polymorph target, then we do want to have it down before turn 4, and it's not that easy to guarantee having a colorless land in the first turns of the game, to turn 2 or turn 3. That can be pretty hard, I think, to guarantee. And so if we have to, I basically think there's too many cases where we aren't able to play this card on turn 2 or turn 3. But if I'm proved wrong about that, then this card could be pretty good. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that the deck necessarily needs a ton more way of generating polymorph targets. I do think it's already pretty consistently creating a polymorph target, but this target this spell can also be used for other stuff, so maybe it's worth it. And then there's Ashnod's Altar. This is basically just in the same way of Cryptolith Rite is a way of generating mana while we're trying to go off. Then this card is the same way, because if we have Field of the Dead on the field, we can sacrifice to generate a bunch of colorless mana. The one thing about this card, I think, that makes it worse than Cryptolith Rites is that, first of all, it's not necessarily that easy to use a lot of colorless mana in this deck. Like, there's pretty strict color requirements on a lot of spells. And while it is good to get a bunch of colorless mana, it can't bring us from having a 0 untapped lands to casting a spell. Like, we probably need something else. And so this card not being able to generate colorless mana colored mana is pretty huge. A pretty huge downside, I think. And I know that that's Phyrexian Altar, but I'm not talking about that card because this card is almost $100. And the other thing about it, I think, is that it does require us to sacrifice the creatures, and we kind of want to do that with our commander. It's not like, I do think that we'll have enough tokens to be able to sacrifice some creatures, also play our commander and have a high enough devour, but I'm not totally sure. Like, Field of the Dead is getting online until 7, and then it starts creating tokens. And I mean, how many tokens can we generate? Will we be able to generate 6 tokens so that we can cast our commander, or will we be able to generate even more so that we have something to play sacrifice to Ashnod's Altar? I don't really know. Yeah, so long story short, I just don't think that we can utilize the colorless mana enough, and I don't think that we are quite there with token generation to just throw them all out of the window for some colorless mana. I do think we still do want to cast our commander, and the game plan is still to generate the tokens in order for them to be sacrificed to our commanders. That's still the main idea behind playing the tokens in the first place. And then Night Soil. This is just a graveyard hate for graveyard-based or creature-based graveyard decks. I just wanted to include it since it does generate tokens. It's pretty nice if you're playing against a Marin deck or something. If not, it's pretty dead. We can't use it on our own graveyard. The good thing about this card is that the exiling of 2 creatures is a part of the cost, so it cannot be responded to, which makes it very powerful hate against creature-based graveyard decks, but it's not really good against any other decks. And since it does require 2 creatures to be exiled from a single graveyard, it's not necessarily even guaranteed to be able to make a token. So, yeah, I think this is a bit too narrow. Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to talk about, just quickly talk about the different worms that we are not playing. And there's basically 5 that I deem even worthy of discussion. I mean, there are small worms, but these are not good, but they're at least not terrible. And first off, we have like Panglacial Worm. It's 7 mana, 9/5 trample. And while you're searching your library, you may play Panglacial Worm from your library. This is pretty interesting. And so first off, it's a 9/5 trample, and that is respectable. It's 1 power below Gotama. So this is the fourth, the worm with the 4th highest power in the game. And then it has this effect of being we can play it from our library while searching. Now there's a ton of different ways to search for stuff in this library or in this deck, between fetch lands and tutors, and yeah, it's not hard to search your library. And so we effectively, under some simplifying assumptions, we can kind of see this card as a sort of companion, in the way that we'll probably always have the option of playing this card from our library or just playing this card. So if we at some point have 7 mana and we don't know what to do with it, we can probably play this card from our library. And I just think that comes back to, and I just don't think that's good enough, or it's basically the war room discussion, where war room is pretty good in the situations where we have nothing going and we're totally out of gas. But the idea behind the deck is not to be in that situation. I would like to construct the deck in a way so that we are not really in that situation that often. So yeah. And next up is Plated Slagworm, and this might be the best of these, or maybe it is. I do think this was probably the best of these. It's an 8/8 hexproof, and that's it. And I just think the hexproof part is pretty valuable because it's protected from removal, so we can kind of guarantee that it gets to live 1 turn around the table for a pay-up spell. Next up is Bookworm. It's 7/7 trample. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life and draw a card, and then you can put it from your graveyard into your library. So I guess if there's no more worms in the deck, you can stick this back into the deck. Yeah. And the purple worm is just a purple worm. It has Ward 2, so doesn't even have hexproof, just Ward 2. It's basically strictly worse than Plated Slagworm, but it's purple. And then Symbiotic Worm, which I have talked about before. It's a 7/7, and when it dies, you create 1/1. Some 1/1 green insect creature turn. This is also pretty nice. This could also be the best of them, since if it dies, we get a bunch of tokens that we can use for a commander. Yeah. So basically the point is that the drop-off from Wellspine Worm, Imperious Great Worm, and Gotama is very, very, very massive, and there is really not a lot of stuff to look for in these cards. Okay, so now I wanted to discuss a bit about how the deck wins. And there are basically 5 main ways of winning. First one is the good old combat step. And for this one, we really need Trample and Haste enablers for our commander. And the next one is Sustained Damage, and this is the Pandemonium and Warstorm Surge enchantments. Next up, we have Burst Damage, and this is something we had talked a bit about already. It's Chandler's Ignition, Rupture, and Kazul's Fury. And finally, we have the Valakut kind of plan B with Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle, and Prismatic Omen. And finally, we have also Endless Swarm. So, combat. And basically, combat should never be underestimated, especially not in this deck. Even though this is kind of a spell slinger deck and you do a lot of combos and stuff like that, you still end up with creatures that have large power and toughness, and they can attack. And so Footfall Crater is kind of an amazing card, in my opinion, because it's an aura that enchants a land. And then the land has tap, target creature gains trample and haste until end of turn. And it has cycling 1. So first off, it costs 1 mana to enchant a land, and it's pretty protected. It's an enchantment, and it's not on a creature, so it's pretty hard to remove it. And most people are probably not going to be super interested in removing a 1 mana enchantment. Next up, it has cycling for 1 colorless. So this is just an amazing ability to have on one of our kind of payoff cards that we don't need in the beginning of the game. So we can just cycle it away and hope to draw a polymorph spell or something else that we need. And basically, I would like all our payoff spells to have cycling 1. And then it gains the creature trample and haste. And I talked about earlier how this is just very good in combat. This is exactly the 2 keywords we want to have on our commander. So it basically makes our commander a 1-punch KO on any player. So if we can play our commander for like 36, Devour 6, and we have this, it's just immediately, if nobody can do anything about it, 1 player is probably knocked out. And the main idea with this, or I should say, the big idea with this is that we can kind of knock multiple players out in 1 turn through these mechanics. So if we can utilize the combat step to knock 1 opponent out, then we can use our mana that we have left up and our sorceries to maybe deal with the rest. And we have already talked about Mass Hysteria. Also pretty good with the Worldspine Worm tokens, like creating 5 or 3 5/5s with trample and then having them gain haste. That's pretty powerful. Like 3 5/5 trample haste worms are no joke. Kessig Wolfrun is a trample enabler on a land, so if we already have Mass Hysteria, we can kind of try to look for Kessig Wolfrun. And then if we get it, we have the same kind of Footfall Crater combo of trample and haste on our commander. And then lastly, there's Overwhelming Stampede, and this is currently not in the main board, but could be. It's basically just works great with a bunch of tokens and one of our big worms and gives them all trample. Especially nice with Mass Hysteria. We can play, if we have Mass Hysteria on the field and a bunch of tokens from Field of Dead, for example, like maybe we have some tokens, we can polymorph into any worm really, and we can play Overwhelming Stampede, and suddenly we have a lethal Alpha Strike. So yeah. And then there's the sustained damage strategy, and this is probably the most powerful interaction in the deck. Wisdom Surge: whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, deals damage equal to its power to any target. Pandemonium does the same, but it triggers for any creature. So it's cheaper, but it also works for our opponent. And the way we want to utilize this is that we play our polymorph into a worm, we dome something for 15 or 16, then the worm might die, but all our polymorph spells basically says deal 15 to 16 or 10 damage on them. So it makes all our polymorph spells into like possibly just lethal damage. And these can just be very deadly. I definitely expect these to be removed immediately by our opponents. And these can also be ways to win with Hypergenesis, where you just dump a bunch of lands and enchantments, and these are one of them, and then you just utilize all your newly gained mana to polymorph a bunch into different worms and basically ping anyone to death. Then there's burst damage, and we have already talked about this, but this is definitely the most surprise factor way of winning. We just play our commander, play one of these spells on them, and we can take somebody out, and possibly take everyone out of the game. Cthulhu's Fury is kind of a bad effect. This is basically a fling effect, but I left it in because it's land on the other side, and it might sometimes win on us the game. And then there's the Valakut kind of plan B, and this is for when we're just really getting hated on, our worms are getting killed, and our enchantments, like our Warstorm Surge and stuff, just can't stick. And so we need another way to win the game, another like sort of dynamic axis to play on. And this is basically playing on lands. And so we play Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. And there's not, I don't think there's even enough mountains in the deck to have Valakut trigger without Prismatic Omen. So this is a 2-card combo in the sense that Prismatic Omen says lands you control are every basic land type in addition to the other types. So we basically want this Prismatic Omen, and that makes every land into a mountain, and every landfall we can get into 3 damage. And then we want to amplify this with Thespian Stage and with Suba to create multiple copies of Valakut the Molten Pinnacle for extra damage, basically. And then we can either kind of slow roll it, play some ramp spells, play our land for turn, and just kind of control the board with these copies of Valakut. Or we can try to play a bunch of lands in one turn, either with Hypergenesis, Manaborn, or Renin 7, and just dump some lands from our field and potentially kill someone. If we assume we have 10 lands in our hand, then 1 Valakut will deal 30, which is probably enough to kill 1 player. 2 Valakuts will then deal 60, and 3 Valakuts will deal 90 damage, split up in increments of 3. So it's basically a game win if you can get to that stage. And lastly, we have the snakes, and I just wanted to show a bit of some things, because when you cast Endless Swarm, you obviously cannot do anything else than cast Endless Swarm every turn. But if you have Kessig Wolfrun on the field, you have a way to spend your mana. So this can be definitely make sure to have this card before you cast Endless Swarm in most cases. Then there's also Mass Hysteria, which works great, giving all your snakes haste. And Warstorm Surge is just really cool to have on the field with Endless Swarm. And that was my update video, and thank you for watching.